So hi everyone, welcome to our session on infrastructure and the environment. We've got one session today and then a second session tomorrow starting at 10. How we thought we would do it. So we only have 3 papers. Sadly, Celine has had to pull out due to family issues. So if you want to go over it into 20 minutes, it doesn't matter. And we thought we would do the 3 papers first and then have a longer discussion at the end, and hopefully have a really good time for a really fertile discussion. So we'll just go through it like it says on the program with Murat, Charisenbrock, then Lucy, and then our discussion. So I shall pass straight over to Professor Murat Arcel from ISS in Holland.
Hi everyone, good to see so many of you and so many people whose work I know or I've met you in person. So it's lovely to connect through. I mean, I always think Zoom is transcribing everything I see, which I don't like. It's the best thing about a conference, I think, is meeting people. So it's good to see at least some of that happening in the virtual sphere. Can you see my screen? It's the right screen, right? I mean, you could see many screens, but this is the one I want you to see. So this is Jessica knows about this. That firstly, thanks to Jessica, because Jessica's actually done all the work organizing this. I'm so like here for the company of wonderful academics. So Jessica knows I have this now. I think it's 4 years overdue book contract on Latin American developmentalism, and I'm resisting all sorts of pressures to finish it. And just last night I finished another book proposal. So I thought instead of writing the book I'm supposed to, I'll write another proposal on an entirely different topic. So this presentation is part of my attempts to procrastinate on the book about Latin America and extraction. My interest in Latin American politics and Latin American extractive dynamics go back to the moment Rafael Correa was elected in Ecuador. That was now 2007, and that as the resident old man in this panel, I'm reading other old men, unfortunately, and in this case, I'm thinking through the work of Michael Mann and his concept of infrastructural power, which really has nothing to do with infrastructures if you think about it, but it just shares a name. So I'm using that as like a reflection on a question that I think isn't often asked and is taken for granted when it's asked. The answer is taken for granted. And the question is, why is it that nation states, not just in developing countries, in general, like infrastructures so much? Why do they keep insisting on them? What do infrastructural projects do for nation states? So that's my main puzzle. Obviously, I don't get to answer it, but I have a couple of critiques of Michael Mann in the process. And the starting point was this billboard in Ecuador I took a picture of in 2009, Esta carretera te lleva el desarrollo. This road takes you to development, which I love. I mean, this is so high modernist, W.W. Rostow type, the road takes you to development. And I have a couple of other pictures like this showing how the Ecuadorian state uses infrastructure and infrastructural developments to give certain messages. But I think it goes beyond what it says in these billboards. Here's another picture of a bridge that was built. I mean, again, most of these things don't make much sense. This bridge is in a town, those of you who've been to Ecuador, this is in the town of Coca, a population of 50,000. And the plane there is a disco bar. It's no longer working, but the main attraction here is the bridge. And the bridge is there, it's a massive bridge that connects a small town across the Coca River. So, I mean, most of these, as I said, don't make sense. So I have a number of observations about infrastructural projects that kind of frame my analysis of why states insist on doing them. One is that this goes beyond left and right. In the Latin American context, the infrastructural push under Rafael Correa, also Evo Morales, uh, was driven by a type of left wing, as much as they wanted to call it socialism of the 21st century, very much a 20th century high modernist way of, we're going to open up the countryside, we're going to move people there, we're going to take goods out, it's going to create structural transformation. So like infrastructure as a tool to achieve long-term, not just economic growth, but structural transformation, where certain different types of economic activities would take place at the national level. Yeah, so that was the Ecuadorian and mostly Latin American experience in the last 20 years or so. But it's not obviously just a left-wing thing. There's quite a bit of emphasis on right-wing infrastructural projects. We recently finished a Geoforum special issue with Alfredo Saad Filo and Fikret Adaman on authoritarian neoliberal developmentalism. And the same type of infrastructural ideologies you can see in the case of Turkey, you can see it in the language of Donald Trump, who spent 4 years saying, "Oh, China is winning. Chinese airports are so much better than American airports." And you can see it in Boris Johnson's airports and things. So it is, I wouldn't say universal, but it definitely defies ideological splits. It's not simply national, these things. There's a very much sort of like regional transformation logic built into many of them, and this is especially the case in Ecuador. Most of these, and this is well documented, it's not speculation, most of these infrastructural projects, I'm thinking big roads, big airports, big ports, they are fundamentally unproductive if you do a cost-benefit analysis, which is surprising, especially in the case of right-wing governments who often come with neoliberal or like a bean counting approach to these things, where it just the actual benefits really don't measure up to the actual costs that in the lifetime of a project. And you can see them across Europe, North America, South America. It is remarkable how unproductive these things, how loss-making they are. They're also they're also environmentally devastating, and this is no longer a surprise either. It's I think up to a point you could have sort of like pretended somehow that we didn't know that big roads or big canals are environmentally not the best idea, but that type of pretension is no longer possible. I think the impacts of, for example, the roads whose pictures I'm going to show in a second in the Ecuadorian Amazon are colossal. So the last bit about strong local support, I'll come back to in a second. But so what shapes the puzzle is that infrastructural developments do not really make much sense and do not really sort of like follow a particular ideological logic, which is why I think we need to ask why nation states are so obsessed with building them. The paper, the chapter of a book that this is going to be was has a methods discussion, which is that we drove on a new road in the Ecuadorian Amazon from the south of Ecuador, from the town of Zamora, which is really the capital of mining in Ecuador right now, all the way to the north of Lago Agrio, Nueva Loja, in the north, which is really the capital of oil extraction. It says there about 714 kilometers. I think it was a bit longer. It took us 2 days, not 9 hours. We had leftover funding and leftover time, and we had never seen this new road. So we improvised and stopped the taxi, and we said, "Can you drive us for 2 days?" And the taxi driver was very happy, of course. And it was an interesting way to see the flagships or road building project of the Ecuadorian state. And where it went and what the Ecuadorian state was trying to do. I won't spend too much time on these billboards. The Ecuadorian state under Rafael Correa was obsessed with these billboards. So like explaining and boasting about what they were able to accomplish. This is, development with roads comes to your province. They spend 580,000 and change dollars for 95 kilometers of roads. This one says roads of revolution. This one said development with equity is true liberty. They're talking about 95 bridges built across the Amazon, including the one whose picture I showed you earlier. So there was this idea that infrastructure was key to Ecuadorian state's transformation, and that was going to accomplish a lot of not just economic outcomes, but also social and political outcomes for people who live in the Ecuadorian eastern provinces, the Oriente, as it's known. And this last picture, I think it's the last one, this last picture also shows you how many of these things were financed. This one, a bridge that makes the future, it was built by a Chinese state-owned company, which was there to extract gold in the south of Ecuador. And all the signs are in Chinese, and it's a rare occasion when they actually came out so openly to show that it's Chinese built. In many cases, they are Chinese finance and Chinese built. In this case, all the labor, all the men, and they were almost always all men who built these bridges were flown in from China to work and stay in compounds run by the Chinese state-owned corporation. Anyway, so this is all of this setting in which I'm trying to think about why states like infrastructure so much, and for that I'm sort of going back to Michael Mann, who I had read back when I was doing my PhD. He distinguishes two types of state power. One is infrastructural power, which he says it's institutional capacity of a central state to penetrate its territories and logistically implement decisions. This is the ability of the state basically to work through non-violent, sort of like despotic, in the use of Michael Mann, tools to. It's essentially the ability of the state to convince society to accept the things it once accepted. Now, this, of course, assumes that there is and the second one is despotic power, which is the ability to implement decisions autonomously without consent from civil society. I mean, there hasn't been much work bringing Mann in dialogue with Gramsci, but the second one essentially is, the first one is essentially hegemony building, yeah, and where hegemony building fails, you bring violence to back it up. The one question that I think Mann doesn't really get into is this idea of what the state wants. I mean, it assumes that the interests of the state are somehow knowable and detectable, and so like you can actually capture it. And there's this wonderful quote from Partha Chatterjee where it says, "Now, how do we know what the state wants? Like what it? I mean, there's the initial question: what is the state? The state is not an entity; it's not a thing. It's a set of relationships, but with a bureaucratic core to it. But within that interest, I think we cannot take for granted, and we cannot even take for granted our ability to actually know what they are. But to a certain extent, I think Michael Mann assumes this to be the case. And then this differentiation then helps him make some interesting generalizations. Of course, this is quite outdated now. He divides despotic power and infrastructural power into two types, weak and strong. So if both are weak, you're looking at a type of setting like feudal medieval Europe. If both are strong, then you're looking at USSR. If despotic power is weak, but infrastructural power is strong, that gives you sort of Anglo-American democracies. It's an interesting typology. Doesn't doesn't really work for my purposes, which is really why I wanted to look at Ecuador through this lens to critique it a little bit more. A quick detour to the Ecuadorian Amazon. I imagine I still have 5 minutes, Jessica?
Yeah, you got 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, the setting of the road in this case to help me ask the question about why the Ecuadorian state wants infrastructure so much is the Ecuadorian Oriente, and the Ecuadorian Oriente was essentially neglected until the 1950s. The Ecuadorian state, on the back of European colonialism, continues to be fundamentally racist against indigenous resident citizens of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And until 1950s, they essentially sort of like, at best, I put benign in brackets because that's obviously a stretch itself. They essentially neglected the Amazon. It was out there, and they treated them as savages that just needed civilization, but didn't really care to even put their racist views into action. That kind of changes with the arrival of North American and European missionaries who decide to convert indigenous people there, which on its own, I mean, as with many of these religious projects, it was justified in its own theological terms. But what it achieved was it opened up these territories for oil extraction. A lot of oil companies came in on the back of the work of missionaries who, among other things, taught indigenous people Spanish, and they learned indigenous languages in return, which sort of enabled both the state and corporations to have a working relationship with these areas. And with the discovery of oil in the 1960s, the situation changed much for the worse. And since 1980s, the region is totally dominated by the despotic power of the Ecuadorian state. And one dimension of this has been internal settled colonization, opening up the territories for also indigenous people coming from the highlands and other parts who are in search of agricultural land. And the state opened up these territories by saying anyone can cut 50 hectares of land and can sit on it for 5 years, can get a title to the land. So there's been massive influx of peasants and workers looking for jobs in either plantations or in oil fields. So the population dynamics of the region has changed quite a bit. And this has been driven by policies implemented by the Ecuadorian state. Now, why does the Ecuadorian state invest so much on infrastructure? One is that it is the Rostovian logic. It opens territory up for accumulation. Without infrastructure, moving resources and moving people in is simply much harder. It extends the spatial reach of state power, and I think this kind of cuts across both of Michael Mann's typologies. It opens up states' despotic power to the region because you can actually roll in tanks, which they did about 10 years ago under Rafael Correa. But you can also send mayors and assemblies and some billboards, all sorts of ways of displaying state power in the region through infrastructure. I think it plays a symbolic role. It demonstrates Ecuadorian stateness, so to speak. I'm thinking here of the debate that Matthew Patterson and Eckersley had about 20 years ago about what are the fundamental tasks of a state. And I think the Ecuadorian state, as with many states, see presence in a given place, and so like the ability to order that space and to bring it industrial development as a fundamental aspect of stateness. So I think infrastructures help states enact their legitimacy, and it's a good in and of itself, but it also enables the extension of other things that the state, I mean, I keep saying what the state wants. Obviously, we don't know what the state wants, but by demonstrating your stateness in a given region, you can then demand more from society or establish new types of hegemonic relationships by signaling your ability to be a state in a given place. And I think since the 1980s, the Ecuadorian state invested a lot into these areas to show exactly that they care about these places and they're not forgotten places. It creates development. Roads. Someone has to build them. So just by hiring people, workers, even if they're menial workers, you end up creating a lot of employment. When you open up roads, people set up shops next to it. So you do create a type of economic growth that counts for something. And the last point, meets societal demands. I think this one is something that's also not discussed enough. There's actually concrete demand on the ground for such things. I mean, we study as geographers, as development studies scholars, we often focus on conflicts and people fighting against things. We hardly ever study people demonstrating for roads. And there are many, 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 many cases in the Ecuadorian Amazon where people are demonstrating for more roads, not less. People rioting because a road project is not completed, or they're rioting because bridges are not sufficiently wide. So there is actually societal demand for these things, which we need to unpack separately, which the state kind of meets by bringing infrastructure. Now, let me wrap up. Within the context of Michael Mann's typology, I think there is a problem in the sort of methodological nationalism in the sense that it takes, for example, Ecuador as a distinct unit, right? And I think that simply doesn't work. The Ecuadorian state is very different in Quito or in Guayaquil in the coast or in the highlands or in the Amazon. The Ecuadorian state is not one. The experience of the Ecuadorian state is not one. We need to spatialize state power and ask specific questions about specific places. There's a considerable degree of Eurocentrism in his typology, and how sort of like both the idea that weak despotic power is more with strong infrastructural power is a US UK thing. The assumption that despotic power in and of itself is problematic. I mean, how it conceptualizes what power is and how it can be used, but also by definition, most developing countries end up being pathologized because they don't quite fit the idea of an ideal Western European, North American society. There are issues about the state society autonomy, which I think is taken too much as a static relationship. There's the issue of, going back to the first point about spatializing state power. I think we need to not assume that citizenship is a universally shared notion in many of these places that we're studying. What it means to be Ecuadorian in the Ecuadorian Amazon is very different than being Ecuadorian in urban spaces. And this is not simply a function of a crude notion of class. I think indigeneity makes a difference, gender makes a difference, or location makes a difference. So people's relationship with the state are not simply as Ecuadorians, but are filtered through many, many, many dimensions, which I guess can be described as intersectional, for lack of a better word. And just as citizenship doesn't quite map onto the dynamics, class doesn't also simply work as a way of understanding state-society relationships, to the extent that a crude notion of sort of like working class versus something else doesn't work. The interests of urban informal classes are often diametrically opposed to the interest of indigenous people in the Amazon. Yeah, even though ethnically they might all be indigenous, I think their interest as poor working people in Theodore Chagnin's sort of like general conceptualization of peasants, not just people who produce food off the land, but also peasants who are basically people who are sort of like surviving for a day-to-day living. Their relationships to the state are different, and their interests don't necessarily align automatically. Anyway, I've gone way too long, so I'll stop there. Perhaps we can have a discussion at the end. Thanks, Jessica, for keeping me, well, trying to keep me, in time.
Thank you, Mira. I've got loads of questions, but I'll keep them back. Okay. And next up is Charis Enns from the University of Manchester and Brock Bersaglio from the University of Birmingham. And while you share your screens, I am doing the time, but it's really hard online to show these things and see if anyone gets them. So feel free to shout out if you want to know how much time you have, or just try and keep an eye out. But I won't sort of interrupt unless it's way over at the end.
I won't go that long. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, let me just. All right. Okay, well, thanks so much for organizing this, Jessica and Mira, although Mira just said that Jessica did all the work, so I guess I can say Jessica. But yeah, we are really happy to see the description of your panel. Sorry. Oh no, I'm so sorry. My technology is already failing me. Yeah, we're really happy to see the description of the panel and to take part. So I'm Charis Enns. I'm based at GDI at the University of Manchester, and I'm presenting on behalf of Brock Bersaglio as well, who's at IDD at the University of Birmingham. And he'll probably take the questions, but I'll do this piece of the presentation. And I'll say right off the bat that we aren't nearly as far along as we thought we would be with this paper, but in some ways that makes it a good time to present because we are open to feedback as we start to develop our analysis. We're also really interested in hearing if others see the trend that we're talking about in the East African context unfolding in other spaces, whether this is a wider trend or East Africa specific. So hopefully we can have some discussion around that too. My plan is to start by just briefly talking about how we're planning to frame the paper and the intervention we hope to make. I'll then offer one example of how we see this trend of getting the ecology right as part of infrastructure-led development unfolding. And I'll talk about finally the implications of this or why we think it matters. So to begin, so we're framing the paper. Our plan is to frame the paper using this idea of, oh goodness, I'm really struggling here. Infrastructure, oh no, sorry, I apologize.
Is everything okay?
Yeah, it's just my my technology is failing me, but I got it now. Of infrastructure-led development. So following decades of neoliberal reform that sought to roll back state involvement in economic development, many states have recently begun to reclaim and reassert their role in facilitating economic growth through state-led territorial design, and specifically through major infrastructure investments. Over the past decade in particular, national policymakers, development policymakers, and planners have placed growing emphasis on infrastructure-led development, which is the idea that reorganizing national space through investment in infrastructure will provide a pathway to development by integrating previously bypassed or disconnected rural areas into global networks of production and trade. As Schindler and Kanai have argued, the ambition of infrastructure-led development is to get the territory right by reorganizing national space so that it can be made accessible and plugged into global value chains to foster export-oriented growth. In this article, what we want to draw attention to is a parallel process of getting the ecology right that also features prominently along state-led territorial redesign and restructuring in the East African context. And what we are suggesting is that alongside all the spaces that are being demarcated and set aside for the construction of infrastructure, and spaces that are being set aside for the type of economic growth that infrastructure is associated with, so free trade zones, special economic zones, industrial parks. There's also more and more land being set aside for the reorganization of environmental space, and specifically to ensure ecological connectivity in an era where economic connectivity has become really important. So this reorganization of environmental space and the assurance of ecological connectivity is becoming a fundamental aspect of territorial design, but it's so far received somewhat less attention in the literature. And I'm going to now provide one example of what we mean by this, or how we see this playing out on the ground. So wildlife corridors are a really effective example of this parallel process of getting the ecology right, of reorganizing the environment as it's reorganized for infrastructure. And this can be seen unfolding in both Kenya and Tanzania. Securing wildlife migratory corridors has recently become a top priority in Kenya's National Spatial Plan. So alongside discussions about connecting different parts of Kenya, different cities in Kenya through national spatial planning, we also see parallel discussions about connecting different ecological spaces through the construction of new wildlife corridors. The purpose of these corridors is to maintain ecological connectivity for wildlife across the country. With national plans stating Kenya is endowed with an enormous diversity of ecosystem and wildlife species, these biological resources are fundamental to national prosperity, to employment, and to foreign exchange. So this so perfectly reflects the type of discourse we see around infrastructure. Infrastructure is essential to national development, to foreign exchange, to jobs, and we see the same type of language used around ecological connectivity, that both types of connectivity are essential to global development objectives. Kenya has a conservation connectivity framework as part of its Vision 2030, its national development plan. And in this framework, or informing this framework, there's been initial mapping exercises carried out to gather information on species abundance and distribution, to map out opportunities and challenges to how wildlife, especially more mobile, larger species, can move across the country, and to put into place plans for securing land for new wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity. Different stakeholders have been invited to participate in this process to identify where land can be acquired for these corridors, and also to develop or to work within existing economic and legal instruments to take hold of this land. Right now, in some cases, land in Kenya is being leased or purchased to secure wildlife corridors that will connect different protected areas. In other cases where new land can't be leased or purchased, we see the creation of new wildlife conservancies on private land or communal land in order to connect existing protected areas. And this looks a lot like what you see with the connection of existing cities or urban centers, the connectivity that's being built in between them. What's also interesting to look at is when you read these reports, the way in which the processes have unfolded to map out, to invite stakeholders in, to do assessments, to figure out where wildlife corridors need to be in the country, looks really similar to the ways in which decisions have been made about where to place large-scale linear transport infrastructure. Save the Elephants is working with the government of Kenya on this plan to design and build infrastructures with wildlife conservation in mind. And they say, in a quote, creating crossing points underneath the railways, over the roads, under the roads, through the roads to ensure continuous connectivity for wildlife and humans will ensure that we achieve the best of both worlds, that we achieve a connectivity for humans and for wildlife. So again, we see this kind of parallel process where infrastructure-led development is being paralleled by ecological connectivity. And the same trend can be seen in Tanzania. In Tanzania, 2 wildlife corridors have become a matter of national interest and investment over the past decade or so. In 2009, the Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute conducted a nationwide survey on the status of existing wildlife corridors. So wildlife corridors are something that exists naturally, but they're also something that is often built or constructed. So the government wanted to look at how these corridors were functioning. Out of that, there were several years of reports and studies on where corridors could be improved or where new corridors could be placed in order to ensure better ecological connectivity by connecting protected areas with land set aside for wildlife movement. In more recent years, land has actually been set aside for these corridors, with a large focus on ensuring elephant mobility across the country and between key protected areas. And unlike Tanzania, where you see, or sorry, Kenya, where you see a lot of land being set aside on private land to make this connectivity possible, in Tanzania, largely land's being set aside on village land to connect protected areas and ensure wildlife movement, changing who accesses that land and how in order to provide ecological connectivity. And so in this regard, coordinating the establishment and maintenance of wildlife corridors in Tanzania has definitely been tied to the ecological health of populations, but when you look closely at the language, much like Kenya, it's also tied closely to the economic development objectives and agenda of the country. Tanzania's current development plan describes wildlife as the cradle of the country's tourism sector and makes the protection of the wildlife habitat a national priority along other forms of economic development. They're implementing key interventions as part of the National Development Plan to ensure wildlife mobility and investment in wildlife corridors and habitats alongside transport infrastructure investment and connectivity for the economy. So Tanzania actually, if you look at their plans, puts these processes in parallel and alongside each other, saying we need connectivity for the economy, for people to move, but we also need to ensure there's connectivity for animals, for non-humans. Now, importantly, this emphasis on wildlife corridors is not altogether new. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a lot of attention on ecological connectivity, connecting protected areas that were functioning somewhat like islands by constructing man-made wildlife corridors, but that kind of fell out of vogue for some time. And now we've just seen it come back in really full force alongside this emphasis on infrastructure-led development. So these two things have appeared together again as national development priorities. So that leads me to the final piece, and that's just, so what? Why does this matter? And I'm going to highlight a few different reasons why we think this is interesting and important to pay attention to. So first of all, we think it's interesting to show and recognize that there is a reorganization of environmental space going on as part of infrastructure-led development that isn't just about disconnectivity. So even in our own work, Brock and I have written about how new infrastructure projects fragment existing habitats. They have bad impacts on the environment. And of course, this is true, especially when you look at linear transport infrastructure projects. They have huge implications, bad implications for the connectivity and fragmentation of habitats. So it's not that we're saying that there aren't adverse environmental impacts of large-scale infrastructure projects and infrastructure-led development. There absolutely is. But there's another side of the story where we also can see that environmental space is being reorganized in ways that creates new types of connectivity for certain types of species and certain types of largely touristic and biodiversity economies. Just like we're seeing new types of mobilities being created for certain economies through infrastructure-led development. Why is this happening? There's a couple reasons. One reason is simply something like social license to operate. There are growing expectations around the greening of large-scale infrastructure projects and infrastructure-led development. Regulatory authorities, lending bodies, investors, and even the general public and media increasingly require that authorities think about the environmental impacts that large-scale infrastructure has on land. And one of the bigger hiccups or problems that many large-scale infrastructure projects can face is not thinking carefully enough about the social ecological implications of their design. So on one hand, it's kind of instrumental that we see more attention being paid to environmental reorganization of space as infrastructure-led development unfolds. But there's a second piece of the story, we think, and that's that just as infrastructure-led development is about opening up hinterlands, about opening up new spaces in often rural parts or disconnected parts of the country for new forms of investment, the reorganization of environmental space aims to do the same thing. So it aims to make nature accessible and attractive to new types of investors and propels nature into global networks of production and trade. And where this becomes really clear, a really good example of this is that when you look at where wildlife corridors are being constructed and the types of connectivity they enable, they often are built on the back of large-scale infrastructure projects so that, let's say in the case of Kenya, people can get from Nairobi to northern Kenya really quickly using new large-scale infrastructure. The wildlife corridors connect different parks that might have not been easily accessible or connected in the past. creating new circuits for tourists to follow that would have often required plane travel historically. So it's not only elephants or non-humans that are moving through these new environmental spaces as they're reorganized easier. It's also tourists. It's also new types of global capital and new types of opportunity to attract global capital. Ultimately, just as transport infrastructure is essential to the production of transnational territories as it stitches territories together so that capital and commodities can move across geographic space, natural infrastructures are equally as important in producing territories that are accessible to global capital in the 21st century. In other words, increasingly we see nature itself coming to play an important infrastructural role in enabling, advancing, and furthering infrastructure-led development, making and maintaining new flows and connections to satisfy capital's desires in remote resource frontiers and hinterlands, as they're often referred to. And then the question becomes who benefits from this, and we're not quite at that point yet, but we do think that when we look at the types of organizations and ventures that are benefiting from nature becoming more accessible, as well as who's involved in making decisions about how nature becomes accessible, we likely see that there's some inequalities there, and that's something we still need to write about. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking more.
Thank you so much. That was a great paper, if slightly depressing at the end. And I was thinking about these never-ending roads and nowhere that you can leave them. Okay, so next up we have Lucy, and saving all questions till the end. I'm sure everyone has loads, but Lucy Goodman from the University of Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope mine's not too depressing after that end, because I'm going to talk about large dams, which by their nature are not kind of known for being a cheery topic. So I'm coming from the University of Cambridge, and my supervisor, who should be on the slide, please don't tell him I didn't include him, is Ambassador.
Oh, we've lost your sound for a little bit.
Oh,
it seems to come in and out.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you when you're up close. Who was your supervisor? I missed that bit.
Bascavira.
Okay, great.
So I'm going to have to stand quite close, which might be a bit intense for everyone, but hopefully it will allow you to hear me.
Don't worry, you're absolutely tiny on the screen. It's not too intense. Go for it.
Great. So I'm also, like the last presenter, maybe a little bit later in my research than I'd like to be for this particular paper. So what I'm hoping to do is to give you an overview of some actual results from other parts of my PhD and try and hopefully situate what's to come within those. And also I'm looking forward to your feedback on the approach that I'm going to be trying to take when I'm looking at comparing these two case studies in the Indian Himalaya. I put my email on every slide, not because I'm a narcissist, but because I'm desperate to talk to people like deep in the COVID PhD writing bubble. So it would be great if anyone wants to reach out at the end to discuss any points. Okay. There we go. So I just wanted to talk a bit about the narrative, which is the context of a lot of the work that I've been doing on large dams, the one that comes up again and again, which is the sense of kind of urgency, panicked politics of the Anthropocene when talking about large dams. So there's climate change, which we need to address really, really quickly. There's still a huge amount of dependency on coal. We need to move towards having solar and wind and other renewable sources in order to try and mitigate climate change. But if you're going to do that, then you need to find some way of stabilizing the grid, because as we know, wind and solar are both very intermittent sources of energy and do not necessarily meet demand. Then people start talking about battery storage, which is potentially not far enough for kind of like balancing the grid of a whole nation. Also pumped hydro or reservoir hydro, where you can release the energy when you need it from the dam. And then there's also some discussion about using kind of inter-area transmission of energy. So there's always this like urgent need to talk about this in the people particularly who are proposing large dams. So when I'm looking at my two case studies, I'm looking at a case study where there is storage, so where you could balance the intermittent supply from solar and wind, but also from a reservoir from a non-storage dam as well. So here's a kind of simplification of most of the research questions for my PhD. So in the global south, I'm looking at how large dams impact on the local economy. And then in two case studies in the Indian Himalayas, I'm looking at why they impact on those people and who do they impact. So is it women or men? Is it different groups of people who are being impacted? And then I have another piece of my PhD which looks at why the large dam debate remains so vociferous and contested, and why there's still so much kind of argumentation around that. And then finally, I look at what can I say with all these different questions together, because I'm using a mixed methods approach where I'm doing a little bit of everything. So for my first research question, I'm using econometrics and remote sensing, which is a very quantitative approach. And then for my second question, I'm using qualitative semi-structured interviews and document analysis. And for my third question, I'm going to talk to you a bit about this as well, but I'm using key methodology.
Lucy, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've just been sent a message by the convener saying that some people are still struggling to hear. I can actually hear you, but it's sort of just fading a little bit. How is everyone else? Is everyone sort of hearing mainly?
You're okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. In that case, Lucy,
it's
sorry.
better now. I just think in some cases where Lucy turns her face a little bit to the other way, when you turn the other way, no, the other way. Yeah, you turn and seem to be talking and the mic seems to just go a little bit off. So if you could just stay where like this, it's a little bit louder. Thank you.
I'm a natural like mover and shaker, so I'll try. This is great for me to try and stay
Oh, Lucy,
still.
I'm sorry. This sounds like a nightmare. You're going to have to be like mouth to the microphone, but
no,
go
it's
for
good.
it.
No, apologies if you missed any of what I was saying just now. But this is the kind of a summary of the results from the first part of my PhD that I was talking about, where I'm looking at how do large dams impact on the local economy. There's maybe a little bit to break down in this particular slide. So as I mentioned, I'm using remote sensing to do this. So many other scholars have linked light at night, so annual light at night, to economic activity. So in my research, I'm looking at how light at night changes around dam sites after the dam has been commissioned, and comparing those to control sites where dams will be commissioned in the future. And so here are some early results in the top right that shows that at different distances, particularly around the kind of 10, 15, 20 kilometer distance from large dams, you do see a negative depression of the economic activity around a dam for a number of years. But as soon as you go a bit further out, which is probably to be expected, maybe 30 or 40 kilometers, you do not see such a relationship. This is hopefully an interesting piece of work, because while there have been some national studies of the impact of where dams have been constructed on the areas locally, and also some like interstate comparisons where you look at national level indicators, there are not so many comparisons of what actually happens on the ground locally between different countries. So this is kind of one part of the way I'm trying to look at these questions. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also looking at why does the large dams debate remain so contested? So to contextualize this a bit, every day I get like alerts about what's happening in kind of the dam news and the dam narrative. So here's a few that I've picked from today and on Friday as well. So you have one kind of title saying that new hydroelectric projects, are they economically viable? When you have another saying that there's this new hydroelectric project in Pakistan that will generate over 1,200 jobs. And then there's a kind of a thought piece on the Grand Inga Dam and the ethical issues around that. And whereas this is not just restricted to the newspapers, you also get a lot of different opinions in the literature, which you'll be familiar with some arguing that economically hydropower is a good idea, some arguing that it's never a good idea, and that they can demonstrate this with statistics. And then others would say that the kind of agendas of local people have been hijacked by some of the research which is being done around this area. So it's a really contested debate. And the way I'm trying to unpack this debate a bit is by using Q methodology, which I think quite a lot of you, including some of the people I can see in the audience, have used before, but maybe some others haven't. So I'll just give a short characterization of it. So I'm looking at opinions from the literature, 37 opinions from the literature on large dams. And I asked people to give their reflections on these opinions and to rank them basically from 1 to 37 in order of how much they agree with them. So what this allows you to do is to get both a characterization quantitatively of what people think about large dams, and also some qualitative discussion around what their opinions are on opinions. And this is something that I had to do because my fieldwork was curtailed by COVID, and it's actually been a really rich way of discussing with people globally what their opinions are on dams and large dams. Obviously, the issue is that I've been engaging with people in English who have great internet connections online, who are familiar with a portal, but it's still been a really interesting discussion. I've managed to talk to multiple academics, activists, people working in government, people who are working for banks, and also consultants, who I think are a really important kind of group. So by consultants, I mean people who write environmental impact assessments, people who carry out cost-benefit analysis. What is their opinion on some of these larger debates which are in the literature? And I wanted to do some audience participation, which, given you can't really hear me, might be quite difficult. But what I wanted to do in terms of presenting some of my early results from this was to ask you what you thought would be opinions that people would agree with across the board, and what opinions people would disagree with across the board. And rather than present you with all 37 statements, I've just given you two. So the first one is dams give countries strategic control over the water of their downstream neighbours. Hopefully you can still hear me, even though someone's reversing outside the window. And the second is large dams benefit economic development. So the question for the audience, for all of you, is which one of these two statements do you think that people agreed with unilaterally across the board, irrespective of what they were? They can either agree with it, all agree, or all disagree. So one of these statements there was consensus on between the different groups. The way I thought you could do this is that you could use the reactions tab, which should be at the bottom of your participation screen. And if you think it's option number one, maybe you can give a clap. And if you think it's option number two, maybe you could give a heart. Or you could just hold up your fingers and get an idea of what you think. So you're looking for the consensus statements, the one that people either agreed with or disagreed with. So yeah, got a couple of responses saying it's one. Two. One of you thinks it's one. I think there's kind of a little bit of consensus around one, and that is the right answer. This is just some early results from just 4 of the statements that more or less everyone agreed that dams give countries strategic control over the water of their downstream neighbours. But more or less everyone disagreed that you should do this when you're looking at their results. Something that really divided the respondents was whether or not large dams benefit economic development. So this was one of the more divisive statements over how the different opinions could be characterised, which is why I'm interested in delving into that a bit further in the latter parts of my research. So I'm looking at 2 case studies to do this. So I'm doing a document analysis. Again, I would have visited these places in person. I've done some like hanging out with a notebook, discussed with people the kind of lived impacts of what it's meant to be in these 2 sites. But I'm restricted to doing document analysis and then having an online discussion. So the reason I've picked these two sites in the Indian Himalayas is this is an area of increasing hydropower expansion. Obviously, geographically, it's attractive for hydropower developers. One is a reservoir dam, and one is a run-of-the-river dam. So run-of-the-river dam just being where water is going down a pipe, and a reservoir dam being where there's a big reservoir, a huge reservoir in Terry, the largest in India. I'm also contrasting them because one is partly World Bank funded, and I'm interested in how that differs from the one that is majority nationally funded. But they were commissioned around the same time, so hopefully they should make an interesting comparison. Just to give you a sample of the literature I can use for this, again, it's mainly English. This is a book of poetry written about Terry by people who were displaced from the region before the reservoir was flooded. I'm also looking at these 2 sites because it's 15 years after they've been commissioned. So I think that's an interesting time period to see what long-term impacts have been. And I'm again using the night lights data, and this is really a hook to structure the interviews. So this is the bit that I've started but I haven't finished. To start generating a discussion with people online, I show them these images and ask them to reflect on what it means for them that electricity has expanded and contracted in some areas. So darker green means more light, and hopefully you can see the years ticking down in the bottom right. And this shows how the light has spread over the landscape in the last kind of 20 years or so. And in 2006, you should see that the reservoir is kind of emerging in the landscape. And obviously this isn't the only thing I'm asking them in these interviews online. Like, for example, I was talking to somebody who was in this particular region who would have been part of the royal family had his palace not been submerged in this area. So people can then, you know, talk about the wider issues, which has been also really fruitful. But I found online it's been really useful to have these as kind of a hook to start talking to people. Just for interest, this is the same kind of animation, but for naphtha jackery, which is the other case study that I'm looking at, whether you can see that there's a pipe that runs from here at naphtha down to jackery. You can see the changing lights over time, which is what I'm using as a kind of to talk to people. So finally, just to kind of sample some of the questions that I'm using, I'm asking people how electricity is used in the area, how this has changed over time, and how electricity has changed for different groups. So has it been differentiated between different people? And how was the construction impacted by different, how has the construction impacted different environmental, social and economic outcomes? So far, I've had some interesting discussions around this, but it's always led, you know, further on to the issues that people particularly care about, and I'm open to those kind of conversations. So just to quickly talk a bit about what it's meant doing a mixed methods approach in my PhD, it's helped me to be able to say something about what remote sensing and statistics doesn't tell you. Because obviously you get some numbers out at the end, but that doesn't necessarily tell you who's been affected. But I'm also hoping it will tell you something about what case analysis doesn't tell you. Maybe I'll be able to situate my cases in some kind of gradient, comparing them to other dam sites. I'm hoping to understand how people's lived experience are impacted by economic change, and particularly light and electricity use, and understand a bit about whether or not the dam's intractable. An emerging theme which has come up across all of my different research questions, which has kind of been talked about a bit already, is around the responsibility or authority for who manages these development trade-offs. That's something that people bring up a lot in the interviews and have some reflections on. So just to circle back to the beginning, hopefully I have time to just have a few kind of closing ideas. So I started by saying that there's a sense of urgency that we need to address climate change right now, and that dams should be part of that solution. So I'd argue that you need to have a sense of urgency around what works. And if I have a small contribution to this area, it would be around trying to understand how the agenda, particularly the complicated vociferous debate on large dams, could be understood. So I just had 3 things to end with, perhaps, that we could talk about if you have any questions for me about things that I think have been working and moving towards shifting the agenda on large dams. One is the increasing number of cases where you could argue that people could have criminal charges brought against them for project documentation, such as the ones that I'm reading from my 2 case studies, where there might be some inaccuracies. This is something that Bernd Freiberg has talked about in some of his papers, and it's interesting whether or not that could be applied. Another is with increasing disasters, perhaps there do need to be some limits put on where large dams should be constructed. I think there's quite a strong argument that building large dams in paraglacial areas, given the context of climate change, is something that could be incredibly problematic.
We've lost you for the last few words.
I was just going to say, I'm back. Just because I can't remember what I was going to say. But we're just going to move on, and I'm sure I'll think about it in the question and answer session. So yeah, I just want to say thank you very much, everyone. I'm sorry for my technical issues and the fact that I lost my notes just before I was able to give this talk. But thank you for bearing with me nonetheless.
Lucy, thank you so much, and you did extremely well with your technical issues. It was absolutely fine. I could hear all of it, and it also sounds like you've done brilliantly to manage such a disrupted PhD and having to kind of come up with all these innovative methods. That can't have been easy, and must have been pretty stressful. So thank you everyone for these great papers, and I'm thrilled that we actually have loads of time for discussion. I think if to participants, if you want to put questions in the chat, or stick your hand up. I'll keep an eye on it. And just while you're doing that, I'm going to go first, with my chair's position, and ask a couple of questions to each paper. So actually, for the first two papers, Murat and also Charis and Brock, I was just, in my own work, I've been really interested by development debates, people like Emma Maudsley and Ilya Salami, about the kind of importance of the sort of intensification of the importance of global finance in some of these big infrastructure projects, and the way that sort of global finance is increasingly overlapping with global development agendas and landing in places like Latin America through these large-scale infrastructure projects. And then in the Latin American context, you know, there's a lot of work on the way that big infrastructure is about the extractive economy and about linking, getting resources out of the region in a kind of regional and global project. So you've both talked about national territory and the state. I was just wondering, you know, how you understand the relationship between the kind of state project and outside influences and funding streams. And then Murat, I was wondering, how does this work how does this kind of state building work specifically in Ecuador, where there are these experiments in kind of plurinationalism and some of the recent projects? Is it going against those kinds of agendas, or does it work very differently in Ecuador because of that kind of politics? And for Charis and Brock, I was wondering, when you were talking about these wildlife corridors, I was just wondering, you know, does it kind of reframe or sideline us from thinking about the ways that these diminish animal habitats, to thinking instead about the way that animal habitats are being accounted for? You know, I guess I was wondering a little bit more about what the impact of these massive infrastructure projects are on existing habitats, and how much they totally reshape and re-territorialize animal habitats in a way that might kind of make us think there's this environmental agenda, but actually is kind of pushing us away from thinking about the way that animal habitats are being increasingly encroached upon. And Lucy, I was wondering, I know you looked at the increase in electricity and lights, but could you talk a bit more about where some of this energy is going? Like, are these dams being built for national, national energy? Is it for export? Is it to replace existing less sustainable forms of energy use, or is it just to accommodate sort of more growth, more urbanization, more? So Murat, I'll pass it over to you first.
Thanks. Let me work backwards. The second one was about plurinationalism in Ecuador. I think, in so many ways under Correa, that agenda was hijacked, co-opted, captured by the Ecuadorian state. The ministry, Semplares, the planning ministry, had staffed to a large extent by people who graduated from my home institution, ISS. So decorated all these ambitious infrastructural projects with references to both newer debates on plural societies, but also going back to all these references to Aristotle and well-being. So they talked a good talk, but in practice, we had I examined one PhD student who shows really that, ministry planning people and then this other entity called Ecuador Strategico would just go to regions with a project in mind, fully designed, and they would sort of workshop it with communities until they got the right answer, and they would keep on presenting the same thing in different ways until the community would say, yes, this is what we want. And they would say, oh, yes, so you do get sewage pipelines and a basketball field. Great, it's exactly, what you want, and we can give it to you. So in some ways, practically, the developmental state, captured this. In other ways, other communities went along with it. Strategically, local leaders thinking this would, entrench their power, or that they could sort of use it to almost, just take what the state gives and repurpose it for their needs. But at the end, I think the practical import of all these things was that not much has changed. Development still was top-down project-based development, and it didn't really, with a few exceptions of places that managed to shut out the state and shut out corporations like the Sarayaku or the Wauranis in some places, not much changed because of the very real discussions about indigenous rights in the Ecuadorian state and its plurinational manifestation. But my reading of this has always been rather pessimistic, I must admit. Others do disagree. Regarding your first question, financing, again, in the Ecuadorian case, I think the ability and willingness of the Ecuadorian state to borrow money or to sell resources to China to achieve developmental goals was seen as an act of national sovereignty, that in a way it was replacing North American dominance. And so like also as an exercise of, look, we can do this in our own country, we can build this is what the country needs, and we're finally able to sell our resources and get enough for it to achieve what the society wants. So even though it was Chinese financed and Chinese built, it was often portrayed as an act of defying global capitalism. But that picture differs, I think, very much in other places. My other case site is in Turkey, where much of the more recent infrastructural projects were either nationally financed or financed through not project financing, but through hot money moving from the quantitative easing in the US, creating money that looks for home and ends up in the Turkish stock exchange or in Turkish corporations. So that money gets channeled in various ways through borrowing. Or new donors, not just China in this case, but from the Gulf, investing a lot. So I think it takes different shapes in different places. But in most cases, the people in charge present the ability to build things as the ultimate proof of the pudding rather than how it's financed. And I think that discourse has often been sufficiently popular to buy consent from large chunks of society.
Thank you. And Brock, are you taking questions? You're on the hook for all the questions.
Unless Karis wants to jump in to start, that's fine.
Do you want to take the regional and global financing one, because you've talked about that recently?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So I think, in the East African context, as much as like there's a kind of infrastructural scramble underway, there's also this scramble to really capitalize on new finance available for wildlife mobility and wildlife corridors. And I think in both countries, Kenya and Tanzania, look quite different. On the one hand, in Kenya, it's a lot of conservation organizations involved and putting up some of the finance for this. But there's also some quite powerful land actors, a lot of white settlers who own, quite large tracts of land that are used for private conservancies, and also own a lot of farms. And they're kind of coming together to sort of parcel out sections of their land or try to acquire land that borders their conservancies to be used as wildlife corridors. So they're kind of involved in actively making these wildlife corridors come into existence and connect into infrastructure. In Tanzania, that sort of is a little bit more heavy-handed, where the state it's much easier for the state to just kind of acquire land in village areas for the purpose of wildlife corridors. But USAID and a whole range of other sort of wildlife conservation organizations are involved in creating the knowledge, doing this, doing the studies, and also trying to map out the sort of most appropriate land. I think it's also, just as a final point on that issue, it's interesting to note that with this sort of conservationists being involved in and financing this, the way that wildlife is understood and studied is also changing a little bit. There's just so much emphasis on mobility and trying to understand the spatial needs and sort of migratory needs of wildlife and fitting that into national spatial planning, whereas in the past it was all sort of about the ecological integrity of protected areas and islands and things like that. So there's this kind of like shift in knowledge that's coming with this new conservation financing as well.
Thanks. That also seems to echo infrastructure narratives around mobility.
And then the second question, actually this relates to what you just said too, the second question around, does this take our attention away from, I guess, the encroachment on nature's habitat, which really does matter? Is that kind of the question?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, well, I think the question, the point we want to make is that there's so many ways you could address social environmental problems created by infrastructure. And you could not do the projects to begin with because they are problematic. But even if you were going to do them, you could do them in ways that would pay attention to, like Winnie's put in the chat box, to pastoralist historic migratory routes or contemporary migratory routes, to existing relationships between humans and animals in regions that really matter. But what we actually see is a shift away from those historic migratory routes towards routes that we are arguing work better for circulations and flows of capital. And I think that's where the interesting piece of it is. It's not that environmental damage doesn't happen or we don't need to think about the adverse environmental impacts. It's how are these problems being solved or dealt with? And if they're being solved or dealt with in ways that are all about attracting more capital into environmental settings where certain groups of powerful people benefit, whether that's international conservation organizations, the state, or white settlers in the Kenyan context, then we need to challenge maybe the ways in which environmental damage is being dealt with. So we're not just reproducing these same global circuits that we see infrastructure producing that only benefit the few.
It is very easy to justify developing a wildlife corridor. You can slap a GPS collar on one elephant and track its movements and use that kind of as justification or a starting point. So
depressing. It is interesting because you're talking about connectivity a lot in the paper, and I was thinking, and also about the way it reframes connectivity between people and wildlife, and the way that's channeled so differently. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you. So just to be clear, for that first part of my PhD, when I'm looking at the remote sensing and night lights, from that I can't tell kind of where the energy comes from and where it goes necessarily. But obviously from looking at the two cases, I do have a better understanding of that. And the universal complaint is that if you're host to a large dam, you then don't necessarily receive energy. And perhaps this is one of the reasons that I see this overall depression of night lights in areas which are hosting large dams after the large dam has been constructed. And indeed, Terry, one of the dams I was talking about, complained as recently as 2014 that they didn't have energy coming from the dam. But it might not be surprising because infrastructure such as Terry is designed to provide energy to 10 states in India, including Delhi. And the solution to rural electrification problems is not to build a whacking great big dam that can provide energy to Delhi. There's engineering reasons why it's very difficult to take a transmission line from a large dam and power just 2,000 homes, because these things cover a colossal distance before they actually get to their plug sockets. So rather, there's better ideas around kind of more disaggregated grids, a reliance perhaps on solar panels instead of on large scale dams. So this is quite a common complaint that is around different dams. And India itself as a nation both exports and imports energy from its hydropower.
Thank you, Lucy. Okay, so do we have other questions? If you either stick your hand up electronically or interrupt me or put it in the chat. And I would also invite you to turn your cameras on. Sorry to those of you in your pajamas, but just in case, otherwise it feels like there's only 4 of us here and we miss everyone else. So do we have other questions? I'm looking for the online hand. Oh, Barnaby. Hello, Barnaby.
Hi. So I had a sort of query for Matt first, which was around your ideas for why infrastructure happens. And I thought, you know, it's a sort of interesting list, and it's something that I've looked at as well. But I wondered, in terms of the sort of the societal demands, which you talked about, how much you have the sort of a need to nuance what people are asking for, and how much it's assumed that the infrastructure is going to sort of bring the ideas of development that they want. So you sort of talk about how people were rioting or demanding roads, but then I wonder if when a road is then built, if that then actually delivers what they're after. I suppose in my work, I often found people wanting services, but then sometimes infrastructure brings those services, sometimes it doesn't. So I suppose there's a sort of need to think, well, how much is that a sort of simplistic demand being made, or something more about services that is then being reacted to with a simplistic solution? And of course, with any protest, there's always a question of how is that sentiment being mobilized, and by whom, and in what way? And then I was interested, or sort of perhaps surprised, but you didn't mention the role of ideas in why infrastructure projects happen. Early on in the presentation, you mentioned Scott's idea of high modernism, which is something that I've talked about, but there's other sort of theories of how ideas matter, whether in a more sort of institutionalist way, sort of socio-technical ideas, but as well as the more ones based on ideology, like the high modernist one. And for Charis and Brooke, I had a question just around how much you think these wildlife corridors are really being followed through on. In sort of the work I did in Tanzania, I could see quite a lot of discussion about it and policy papers being pursued, but often it was mainly being driven more by donors and NGOs than the government. And then there was often a lot of contradiction between the professed idea of having a wildlife corridor versus then the reality of giving out a load of licenses for mining or oil prospecting or whatever. And the sort of particular example in Tanzania that comes to mind is this idea of a corridor between the Selous Game Reserve and then Mozambique to the south. But then the way in which, particularly under Magufuli, the government really has gone about dismantling the Selous Game Reserve as and just sort of dismissing the concerns of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee and other environmental groups. So I was sort of wondering how much you see the wildlife corridors really being implemented, or is it something that's sort of more remains on paper? Obviously, it's hard to verify with COVID, but yeah, thanks.
Should I start? Yeah. Thanks, Barnaby. Let me start from the last one. The role of ideas. I mean, it's a good point. I think I've kind of subsumed it under ideas of development, how it's done and what it looks like. I mean, there's pretty strong consensus in a certain type of development thinking where, you know, roads do help structural transformation, and that, you know, they need to be done by the state. So all these things are, I think, part of the package, but you're right. I think we could unpack them a bit more and sort of like point out that some are more valid than others. I mean, just because an idea doesn't mean it's invalid. Just because, I mean, and you know, I have this long-running debate with one of my co-authors, Lorenzo Pellegrini, about the difference between ideas and ideologies and how we sort of like study those. But I think we're in agreement there. Regarding the first question about why do people want these things and how, I mean, in the Ecuadorian case, we did write with Lorenzo, we did write a paper called Maria's Paradox, where we argue that people want, in that case, not infrastructure, but increase extractivist investment. They want it because it's the only thing that's left. I mean, we argue that when you can't sort of like live, quote unquote, in traditional ways, when there is no option for ecotourism or sustainable agriculture, when basically there's either employment in an oil field or even worse type of misery, then that's what you want. So it's the absence of concrete options or the elimination of the existing options, which then drive people to, if you lose your field, if the animals have run away, then you think, okay, I can be a taxi driver, then I need a better road. Or, it's if the state won't invest in hospitals, then you want a road to take you to the hospital in the big city. So in a way, the demands are sort of structured by what's been done before. These don't fall from the sky. I mean, if you historicize it, then it's that. And the flips, it's not the same thing. I think it's the flip side. It's also a type of thing that the state is willing and able to deliver. Now, there are certain demands that are impossible to meet, whereas demanding a bridge, you might just actually get it. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing. Why do people demand it from the state? Because the state can give it. And why does the state give it? Well, because people demand it. But it is the type of demand that is realistic, and it, in an electoral democracy, showing up in a village 5 years later saying, you voted for me, I gave you a bridge, now vote for me again and I give you a bigger bridge. That dynamic is functionally, I think, quite useful for people. But that, I think this is the Ecuadorian case. My other work in Turkey, I think the idea that people are forced to structure to want these things, I wonder if it has some sort of like a time limit to it. In the Ecuadorian Amazon, this is very much happening right now. In rural Turkey, the state has been beating people on the head for 100 years to modernize them. And the state logic has been internalized. I mean, you know, interview after interview, poor peasants sort of verbalize stateness in their discussion. Oh, we need to open this mine because the Western powers want to stop us from doing gold mining. But it's going to destroy your field. Yeah, but we have to do it because, you know, it's against imperialism and the Turkish state is. So 10, 15, 20 years, you can kind of write this off in a form of false consciousness. About 100 years later, when it's been so thoroughly internalized, I don't quite know how to describe that notion where people want things that you and I objectively see as problematic for us or also for them. I think people act like the state, and you know that's a separate case from the Ecuadorian case.
Cool, thanks for the question. So just for context, the bit of southern Tanzania that sort of this paper draws from is around Ruaha National Park and between Ruaha and the southern highlands towards Mbeya. But yeah, I mean, actually, you know, these corridors are being implemented, land is being allocated, committees are being set up, district governments, again, in southern Tanzania are having to acknowledge and kind of treat these things as actual corridors. You know, that doesn't mean hunting tourism is immediately happening, that investors are coming and investing in lodges or anything like that. And in fact, a lot of the time, corridors can look quite empty or unchanged. But they're definitely being implemented and invested in sort of to various extents. Yeah, it looks different in both countries, but I guess that would be the short sort of answer.
And if they don't happen in the Kenyan context, it isn't from a lack of commitment by the government by any means. It would be contestations on the ground over land use from both pastoralist communities and small scale farmers that aren't necessarily willing to be living next to wildlife corridors, which obviously can be dangerous to live next to. But there's really meaningful government commitment in the Kenyan case to get these wildlife corridors in place. There's just now politics that will play out over land.
Yeah, and that's a good point as well. In southern Tanzania, I think, you know, while people cannot see a lodge or people coming to shoot game, the government is under a lot of pressure to allow small scale mining to happen, artisanal mining to continue happening and that kind of thing. So you kind of have this transition period as well in some places.
I know we have a question, but just to jump in on, because I can. With these wildlife corridors, do they ever are they always like under the big transport corridors? Like, do they ever shift the planning of the hard infrastructure, or do they always work around it?
I think the wildlife corridor placement is used when there's plans for large-scale infrastructure projects. The potential of tourist circuits and wildlife development, I guess, is used to provide support for infrastructure. So I guess they co-constitute one another would be the best way to say it. But when you look at Kenya's national spatial planning, both of these potentials to move wildlife in new ways and to move capitals and commodity in new ways they're working together in selling these projects to the public and to financiers.
Thank you. And now, Shalaja Fennell, sorry to have jumped in there. Over to you.
Not a problem, Jessica. Shalaja Fennell here from the University of Cambridge. I was trying to think, as I heard all three presentations, about going from Murat's point about, high modernism to thinking about the current crisis, about why we're concerned about infrastructure. And wondering whether there is a way to kind of come at it, there's a meso level. So going to the 70s, that whole narrative of the urban bias, that you're doing investment in the urban, but not in the rural. And then coming forward today in the whole thing about placemaking and why place matters. Thinking about what is being said is the fabric of investment, is it not? It's not just about whether it's a road to take you to the city because, you didn't migrate in the last generation, so you get your chance now, which is often, for example, if I was parodying what's happening in Ethiopia, you would say that's what's happening. You're getting places, really hot places, from close to Djibouti, and people are now moving up because they can't do anything. And is there not a need to open out the skeins of what is therefore happening? I like Murat's term about statism, and I was thinking of what kinds of statism. Is there a local statism? What's the role of the local headman or headwoman? Or, how does one look at it in different scales? So I was trying to problematize it because there are so many development actors. And so I was thinking, for example, in what Lucy was saying, I mean, there's the headman in the village, and there's groups of villages, and then all the way to Delhi. Or I was thinking particularly about Tanzania, and I think in your response, Brock, you brought up very, very clearly that, who then has agency? Who claims different forms of statism? Are we seeing different types of statism in collaboration or in competition? There's something very exciting here about 21st century capitalism. I don't mean exciting as positive, but intellectually something that's going on here. And so big question over to all of you in the last 5 minutes. But I really enjoyed all the papers. Thank you.
Okay, so who wants to go first? Murat, shall we pick on you first because you spoke first, and then we can go Charles, Brock, and then Lucy.
Okay, I'll try. No, thanks, Shalaja. That is a very good question. I don't know if I have an answer. I think I often sort of like try to compare the different places I work in. I think that the Turkey Ecuador thing really sort of helps me make a bit more sense in my mind about how these things work. And I think it is really, I think the fundamental sort of like hierarchical nature of the state and its ability to change things and deliver things really, and I think I was going to say infect, and I stopped myself, and then I decided I would go ahead with it. I think the hierarchical nature of the state infects all relationships, even at a distance from the state. And in this way, going back to Michael Mann, the infrastructural power, I think, is a fundamental sort of component of state power is the way in which relationships are structured in a hierarchical way, which then creates all these linkages. So the local indigenous leader, when he, as they often are, ends up getting chosen, then he starts speaking the language of the state, because he is now relating and establishing relationships with people who can help him get things done. So most of the time, the combination of what is possible and how do you get it, I think imbues all social dynamics with the logic of the state. And that, I think, then can explain why in so many places, projects that don't necessarily make full sense. I mean, of course, you want to go to the hospital, you want to get to the market, but oftentimes these things are not sufficient to explain it. But I think it's the logic of the relationship that comes with the presence of the state itself is what gets them across the threshold. And yeah, so the more the state is present, I think the more the logic of the state becomes dominant. And I think we need to understand it a bit more. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's what came to my mind. Maybe, hopefully, the rest will add to it.
It's such a nice question. I don't have a good answer, but it makes me think, is it, when we look at Selu or Ruaha and how infrastructure is playing out there, is the state confused? And so it's playing out in multiple ways and doing multiple things at the same time? Or are there, like you said, competing and collaborating interests? I'm not sure. Like, is it just chaos and that's why you see oil development and wildlife corridors and large scale infrastructure all happening in the same space at the same time? Or is it actually that there's multiple competing states working at different scales, or state aspirations? I don't know the answer, but it's something we'll have to think on more. I like the way you phrased it.
Just jump in, I can share some thoughts. I think it is a really interesting scale to be thinking at, because often, it's characterized kind of like talking about the state, you should sacrifice your local area because that will benefit the state, or even kind of at a smaller kind of district level, other districts are further along enough, so we need to catch up, so you need to make this like sacrifice. But it's actually the meso level where people are really impacted. And maybe one thing that I see in my research of the document analysis is how often there's almost a willful conflation of the meso level, the kind of village scale, with the state. So if a state representative says, we want to do this, that could be taken as then a meso level statement, when actually trying to get at that level of decision making is really difficult, particularly if the structures have been broken up by displacement, by the threat of infrastructure coming, meaning that people move away, stop investing in their community before it's even happened. So it's a really interesting kind of scale to be looking at, because when it comes to families, then people do kind of start to become visible and engage again. But there's this kind of intermediate, very ephemeral, difficult to pin down level of administration, which is more informal, which is nonetheless very important in how it's kind of encountering different levels of decision making when it comes to trying to shape the infrastructure and the impact of those people. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a really interesting scale to be thinking about.
In the Latin American context, it's also interesting because, there's also these other very fertile debates around territory and Latin American conceptualizations of territory and bids for territorial autonomy, which are probably most clearly seen in indigenous territories, and the idea of territorial sovereignty and different kinds of state making. So the question about what these big infrastructure projects do to those kind of spaces, when you talk about, new logics, following state logics, or Murat, what you also talk about, which is the kind of dirty politics of the way that opposition is sounded out. So I guess it seems really interesting in Latin American context too, in terms of the different kinds of states that are enacted by some of this infrastructure. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Quite hard to keep an eye on. I don't think so. Do any of the panelists have any questions for the other speakers, or any final things you want to ask or say?
Maybe a reflection, a sort of question for the other panelists when you're thinking about roads and particularly conservation interventions, because in my former life I worked a lot on conservation, particularly in Mozambique, but also in other areas like Sierra Leone. And this kind of narrative that we want a road came up a lot. in terms of we want, in order to do this conservation action, we want to exchange that for a guarantee that we will get the road. And kind of reflecting on Barnaby's question, in that instance, it was mainly about access to services, what the road would bring, access to services, particularly. I found in both contexts that I worked in, access to maternity care, because sometimes your life might be saved by being able to have a C-section in a hospital rather than dying at home, which is quite a big driver to try and get access to a road. So I was wondering if Rob and Cherries had ever kind of had this, if this, then that kind of narrative come up in your discussions in Tanzania. The question is clear.
The question's clear. It's a good one. I think in the cases we're looking at, the corridors are not they're not, how do I say this? They're independent of each other. The road and the transport infrastructure is going to happen, and so are the wildlife corridors. So there's not much room for negotiation. Is that right, Brock?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's more about how it unfolds and what precisely the route might be, for example, of a migratory corridor, which I think is a little easier to justify sort of shifting in light of a road or whatever. But that same kind of promise, and I don't know if this is actually what you're getting at, but it's interesting to note, of a road bringing an improved quality of life, that is also attached to wildlife corridors, especially ones that are meant to be attracting tourism and ecotourism. So we've had communities say, like, we know conservation brings roads into our community because tourists need to drive in. We know that that means we can get, like you said, the hospital easier. So there are all sorts of sort of infrastructural promises attached to some wildlife corridors as well. I don't think that's true across the board, but and that would be the case in Kenya and in Tanzania as well.
Murat, do you want to say anything about that question?
No, I think yes, I guess one quick thing, that I think the idea that, I think it's the reverse of Lucy's question, that sometimes people want roads again, I'm thinking Ecuadorian communities that we're in touch with, they want roads and go along with it, even though in the long term, this has a negative impact on conservation. So we have spent some time with one community where they were opposing roads precisely because they anticipated what the impact was going to be. So they said, we want a road, but if we get it, then this will happen. So that's why we shouldn't have it. And they fought against it. There was no, they suspected that a proposed road building project was the first step of opening up their territories for extractive investment to come in. And they said, no, we don't want the road, even though, yes, we'd like that. It takes 6 hours by the river. Road would be 45 minutes, but we see that this will have a domino effect on both ecology and society. So no thanks was the line. So that was an interesting dynamic that was sort of like verbalized that I didn't see before.
I'm going to jump in here too. In my own research in Bolivia, which has been about road building projects in the Tipness, actually, I get frustrated sometimes because I think maybe sometimes in academic literatures we're not specific about what kinds of roads we're talking about, and actually that communities might want a connecting road or an access road or a small road, but these like massive infrastructure projects are not that, and that's never on the table. And actually thinking, Lucy, about some of the sort of innovative things you've done around methods, but I think one good thing about case study or qualitative approaches is just like capturing those processes through which those negotiations are shut down. And I also feel like sometimes it's really difficult for people to accept that some places don't want a road, even though, Murat, I know you're interested in the kind of the cases where people are pushing for it when you wouldn't expect it. But I also think sometimes there's a real lack of acceptance that people might not want a road or want a different kind of travel, and that gets really, really, really pushed out of these discussions. Do we have any final comments? Because otherwise I will say thank you so much to all our papers.
Thank you. And tomorrow, there's a session tomorrow morning, right?
Yeah, we have a session tomorrow morning at 10:15.
That's great.
Do join us. And thank you so much for everyone for these excellent papers. And although we were sorry to lose Celine, it's been great to have longer for discussion. And yes,
Yes.
goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your questions.